This
There we go. All right, Ben Rood, it's all yours.
Me, the presenter, right?
Yeah. We'll do that. Should be good.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay, let me start my slide presentation. Okay, you guys see that okay? You can hear me okay?
We can see you. We can hear you. It looks good.
Awesome. Okay, well, as Tracy said, I'm Ben Rood with WSP. I'm excited to present today on the NFIP Letter of Map Changes Program overview. And there's a lot of things that we can cover today about the Letter of Map Changes and that program with FEMA. And I kind of want to start with a few background pieces of information. We'll do an overview. Let's see if I can get these to progress. An overview. We'll talk about some of the modeling that goes into floodplain mapping and how that's applicable to the letter of map change process. We'll talk about the FEMA NFIP codes. Everybody should be somewhat familiar with 44 CFR 60.3. A, B, C, and D, and those different codes play into the letter of map change process. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those, and some of the requirements behind that, and then we'll talk about letter of map change types, submittal requirements, and then we'll go through some examples that I've worked with or had experience with. And if you guys have questions along the way, feel free to chime in. Or ask questions in the chat, and Mackenzie and Tracy, if you guys get questions along the way, just interrupt me and we'll try to go through the questions and address things. And then there will be a few knowledge checks throughout the presentation. So as we get to those, we'll just have you guys type those into the chat, and that's how we'll account for the CFM credits for this presentation. So, okay, let's jump right in though and do a little bit of overview. So as most of you are aware, the NFIP program is something that FEMA has established to help regulate floodplains throughout the United States, and communities are voluntary members of that program. As part of that membership, you receive flood insurance maps and flood insurance studies, and those maps and studies are how along with the community ordinance, is how you regulate the floodplains in your community. Well, we all know that those maps and studies are kind of a static snapshot in time. They don't always reflect change that is happening throughout the community. And that's really what we want to talk about today is, as changes occur in your community, it's important that we keep those maps up to date. And then it's also important to have ways to change those maps. And FEMA has established that official process as the letter of map change process. And we're going to talk about the different ways in which we can get changes to those maps. So there's different types of information that's available. I put links here in the presentation for the FEMA Map Service Center. That's where you can go on and get your maps. You can also get any LOMARs or LOMAs, which is what we'll be talking about today, on the website. So you can go on and download the historic LOMAs that have been submitted in your community and review those so you're up to speed on what information is available that has already been submitted and approved by FEMA previously, as well as the effective information. And then there's also the digital viewers to be able to see your floodplains. Talk a little bit about floodplain decoding. So as we go through this revision process and this presentation, we're going to be talking about different zone types. Zone A's are approximate zones. As you can see on this map here, they're generally just a shaded zone A, and they don't have a floodway. They don't have base flood elevations usually. And so that information you deal with differently in the letter of map change process, whereas zone AEs, you have a base flood elevation. You oftentimes have a floodway. That information is important as you're moving forward with the letter of map change process. So you understand what information is available on the map and then use that information to be able to develop your application. There's also zone AOs and zone AHs, which are kind of your ponding zones or your depth zones. So those are important as well. So you understand the different applications of letter of map changes within those zones. Okay, let's talk about modeling a little bit. I want to make sure that we cover the basics of modeling because, you know, modeling is what establishes the mapping and what establishes the FIS that you're regulating to. Well, as you know, engineers, as we put together models, either a hydrology model or a hydraulic model, those models are a snapshot in time. We do our best to come up with the backup data that we put into those models, but it's not always, as time changes, those model inputs may change, or you know, the model may not be accurate anymore because it was developed long enough ago that it needs to be updated. And so talking about modeling is just kind of helping us establish that baseline of why we would need to change a map. Well, maybe it's because the model is out of date or the model doesn't reflect changes in hydrology or hydraulics that exist today. So as a basis, hydrology, that's how much flood water is going to come down the channel, and hydraulics is what the water depth is going to be. So that's how high the water gets within the channel. So there's two different modelings usually that, or two different types of models that go into a flood insurance study, a hydrology model and then a hydraulics model. Talked a little bit about hydrology. People are pretty familiar with the hydrologic cycle, but you have rainfall runs off, collects into channels, and then runs down the channel. You know, as precipitation data changes or as land cover or land use types change, obviously that can change those models. If there's a wildfire, if there's something that impacts the hydrology, that could change how much runoff comes down the channel, and therefore changing the model results, which would then constitute a letter of map change. Usually, you know, there's different methodologies. I won't get into all of them in rainfall runoff modeling, but just be familiar with the fact that rainfall modeling is, you know, runoff modeling is how that data set is established for the flood discharge. So oftentimes we'll use like a flood frequency gauge analysis. Well, that's an analysis of the gauge data that's available at the time of the study. And so as more years progress, there's a potential for that gauge analysis to give you different results because of the amount of data that's available for the study. So that kind of establishes that base level of, you know, time changes things, and as we get more data, that may change the hydrology results of a gauge analysis. Same thing with regional regression equations; those change as more data becomes available. So hydraulics, usually 1D and 2D 1D and 2D models are used to establish hydraulics, and those models are highly based on, you know, topography data and land cover data. And so as any of that changes, then potentially there's you know, different results that could come out of a model. Now, these are just some examples of different softwares that are used for 1D and 2D modeling: HEC-RAS, HEC2, HY8, Master, and then HEC-RAS 2D, Float 2D, SRH 2D. So our first knowledge check is for you guys to put in the chat. What estimates the flood elevation from the base flood? So we're talking about flood elevation. Is it a hydrology model that gives you the flood elevation, or is it a hydraulics model? You just type A or B in the chat. Type your answer in to get your knowledge check points. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to just cover that because I feel like it's important backup information to understand, you know, why would we need to do a letter of map change, or when is it applicable? Because, you know, as communities, as you're regulating your flood insurance program, it's important to understand what goes into those maps, what things have been used to establish those maps, and then how do we go about changing that information, understanding, what level of detail it is that has been studied. So let's talk a little bit about the code. So Federal Regulation 60.3, there's different sections of this, generally referred to as A, B, C, and D. And each of these different sections kind of have its own nuance in terms of when letter of map changes are required, or the level of effort that has to go into those letter of map changes. So under Section A, the no special flood hazard area, 60.3A covers areas where no special flood hazard has been established on a map. So this would be if you're a community that has a drainage channel that has no flood zone, there's no FEMA regulatory map on it, then you're under 60.3A, where there's not a regulatory floodplain or a special flood hazard area. So in that case, there is no letter of map change process. Because FEMA has not established a regulatory floodplain there, then it's up to the communities to regulate that based on best available data and, to a reasonable assurance of, flood, making sure that's reasonably safe from flooding. And so because of that, there is no letter of map change process. So if you're under 60.3A, you don't go through the LOMC process. Under 60.3B, that is a zone A floodplain. So it generally does not have a water surface elevation established. So the letter of map change process generally associated with 60.3A or with 60.3B is the LOM process, letter of map amendment, or a letter of map revision based on fill. We'll cover both of those in this presentation, but there are some cases where a letter of map revision or LOMAR is applicable to a zone A, but oftentimes it's, at least in my experience that I've seen, it's oftentimes a LOMA or a LOMAR F when you're in a zone A. And again, that's the standard of reasonably safe from flooding. And so, you're reviewing stuff to make sure it's reasonably safe. When you're in C, so 60.3C, you've got a zone AE, generally, floodplain, but it doesn't have a regulatory floodway. And you're required to make sure that any encroachment in the floodplain does not cause more than 1 foot of rise. And so that's generally, you're going to be looking at all of the different LOMC processes there. You can do LOMAs, you can do LOM RFs, you can do LOMARs, you can do CLOMARs, all of this stuff applies. Same with D. The difference between 60.3 C and D is D has a regulatory floodway, and there are stipulations within C and D that require you to do a CLOMAR. If your encroachment in your floodplain is going to cause more than 1 foot of rise in a zone AE without a floodway, so this is C, section C, if you're going to cause more than 1 foot of rise, then you have to go through the CLOMAR process. If you're in section D and you're going to cause any rise in the regulatory floodway, then you have to do a LOMAR or CLOMAR process. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But wanted to cover these just so that everybody has a basic knowledge of A, B, C, and D, what those sections are, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the different LOMC processes that apply in those different sections. So, okay. So, FEMA letter of map change types. So a letter of map change is a letter that reflects an official amendment or revision to the effective firm. To get a property removed from a special flood hazard area, FEMA must issue a LOMC. So in order for you to not have to pay flood insurance on a property and to have it removed from the special flood hazard area, you have to have a documented letter from FEMA saying that they have approved your LOMC process, whether that's a LOMAR, a LOMA. There is an actual recorded letter that you receive. It's called the letter of final determination. And that is the letter that you keep on file to show that you have met the requirements to remove your property or house or land from the floodplain. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of the basics of LOMC. So there's two types of categories for a LOMC. There's an amendment or there's a revision. So amendments are generally when you apply for a LOMA, a CLOMA, a LOMARF, or a CLOMARF. Those are all considered amendments. The way you do that is you use the MTEZ or the MT1 forms. Those are digital copies, or there's also an online version of the MT1 form that you can do through the online LOMC process with FEMA. You request must pertain to a small area of high ground, like a property or a structure located within a special flood hazard area, misspelled that there, sorry, or the placement of fill on a property. And you are a homeowner or a leasee, developer, or community official, or acting on the behalf of such. So you're basically asking for an exemption or a removal of that small piece of ground or structure from the special flood hazard area because it's located on ground that is higher than the base flood elevation. Whether that's natural ground or brought in fill, either way, you're going through the amendment process there. You're not going to change the maps. The maps stay the same, but that specific parcel or property gets removed from the floodplain based on a letter that you receive that LOMA or LOMARF was granted. The revision process is when you're actually going to modify the maps. So you're going to actually change the floodplain map to reflect the LOMAR process. And you can complete the MT2 forms to go through that process or the online LOMC, and you're requesting revisions to the effective FIS report or firms. So sometimes the LOMAR can modify the panels or the actual maps. Sometimes it modifies both the maps and the FIS report. Okay, so let's talk about a LOMA. So letter of map amendment. And then we're going to go look at a quick example of this. So typically a LOMA is issued when small areas of natural ground or structures are shown to be above the base flood elevation through elevation data and out or outside of the special flood hazard area, which is considered out as shown. So that's what a LOMA is. It's the natural ground. The ground that has been there forever is higher than the floodplain. And you're presenting that elevation information to FEMA and saying the area around our structure or the area within this parcel of land where we've identified is actually higher than the base flood elevation. Even though the maps show that it gets inundated, it doesn't get inundated because we're showing you the elevation of the land is higher than your flood elevation. So how do you determine that? Well, to determine that, you have to have a survey of the land, and you also have to know what the base flood elevation is. And so on a zone A map, you have to be able to establish what that BFE is. And that's using either simplified or detailed methods, depending on the appropriate approach there and the community, what they allow. There's actually a training that we've been putting on throughout the state. The next one I think is July 6th to help people understand how to establish a BFE in a zone A floodplain using the simplified and detailed methods. So if you want more information on how to establish a zone A floodplain BFE, attend that training. I'm not going to go into the details here. From a zone AE floodplain, the BFEs are actually on the map. And so you can pull the BFE from the profile from the FIS study and establish what that BFE is, and then show that the survey of the land around the structure is higher than the BFE, therefore the LOMA can be processed. Not very often, but sometimes there's a need for a CLOMA, so a conditional letter of map amendment. Sometimes that's when a new structure wants to go in, but they want to make sure that if they're going to build that structure on natural ground, that is eligible to be removed from the floodplain. And so you can actually submit a CLOMA to FEMA before the structure is built, get approval that all that ground you're going to build on is above the floodplain, and that structure would be removed from the floodplain if built in accordance to the LOMA or the CLOMA application. And then generally after you build the house, then you have to go back in and submit a LOMA to get final concurrence from FEMA that everything is how it should be. And the LOMA is what will give you that letter of final determination, which you'll keep on file to prove that you don't have to pay flood insurance. Let's look at one example of a LOMA. So this is along the Jordan River. The Jordan River mapping through this area is Zone AE. We've got base flood elevations, and based on the natural ground, it was determined that these houses here plus these houses here that are shown. I guess you guys maybe aren't seeing my cursor. Let me get a pen. And let's see if we can draw. There you go. So we can see these houses here. There's a couple LOMAs that are on file for these houses. And these houses were removed from the floodplain based on elevation data showing that land that they were built on is actually consistent with the neighbors' properties as well, that it's all above that base flood elevation. Even though it's shown as inundated on the maps, the elevation data confirmed that no, the map's inaccurate there. The elevations are actually higher than what is shown on the maps. So a LOMA was submitted for those homes, and now they don't have to pay flood insurance. Okay, any questions so far on LOMAs before we go into LOMAR Fs? Okay, hearing none, let's talk about LOMAR F. So LOMA, think natural ground. LOMAR F, think fill. So LOMAR Fs are based on fill material. So it's still similar to LOMAs, but instead it's when the natural ground is elevated because the property or structure was built on fill material that was brought in. So now we've elevated that natural ground above the base flood elevation using fill. And now we're doing an elevation certificate that's signed by a professional land surveyor engineer that can get that show that that property has been elevated out of the floodplain. And then we file the LOMAR F through the LOMAR F process. Very similar to LOMAs, you'll get a letter of final determination that tells you that FEMA concurs that that property has been removed from the special flood hazard area. There's also a CLOMAR F process, which is a conditional letter of map revision based on fill. That's often used when there is a proposed structure that's going to be built, and they want to make sure that before they build the structure that the proposed structure is not going to cause them to be in the flood zone, or that the proposed structure and the fill material brought in is not going to cause a rise in that floodplain. So, but a CLOMAR F requires that a LOMAR F be submitted after the fact to make sure that you get final determination from FEMA. Once the structure is built is when you can file those final elevation certificates and get their official buy-off. So just because you got a CLOMAR F doesn't mean you're going to get out of the special flood hazard area and not have to pay flood insurance. You have to actually finish that up with a LOMAR F once you have the final elevation certificate. So let's look at one example of that. So property here, this is lake flooding out here. You can see that the lake flooding kind of inundates an area adjacent to this property. The reason you can kind of see that, hey, but it doesn't actually touch the structure. The mapping's actually been updated here. These LOMAs that are shown on the map are actually LOMAR Fs. So when FEMA puts them on the map, they just show up as a LOMA, but they're actually submitted as LOMAR Fs. And the reason we know they're LOMAR Fs is because you can see in the aerial all the fill material that was brought in, on these lots, all these little mounds are all the fill material that was brought in to get these lots above grade so that they were no longer in the special flood hazard area. Since all of these LOMAR Fs were approved, the mapping was updated, and now it reflects what was shown in the LOMAR Fs, that this subdivision actually brought in fill material and brought the entire subdivision out of the flood hazard area. And so based on the fact that we know fill material was brought in, we're not going to do a LOMA, we're going to do a LOMAR F because it's based on fill. And oftentimes, if we were to go in and try to submit a LOMA, on this piece, and FEMA went into the map and saw all this fill material being placed, they would probably question us on it and say, hey, we see a bunch of fill material on this lot. We know it's not a natural ground scenario, therefore a LOMA doesn't work. You have to do the LOMAR-F process. Okay, any questions on LOMAR-Fs?
This conference will
yeah,
now
there's a
be
question on
recorded.
how long does it typically take to receive a LOMAR F? Do you know about the time frame on those?
The last one that I did was about a 3-month process. It didn't take very long. We got the elevation certificates done. We got the application submitted to the city. So the city has to approve. We'll talk about that, but the city has to approve the LOMAR-F process. On the MT1 forms, there's a community concurrence section. They have to buy off on that. So get the elevation certificate, get the application put together, submit it to the city. Takes a few weeks for the city to review it and approve it, put their signature on it, and then you send that in the online loan seat to FEMA. And it only took a couple months for FEMA to review it and approve it. They did ask a couple of questions for clarification, but once we answered those questions, which all came through the online portal, once we answered those questions, it went through without a problem. So plan on a few months. Generally, that means that homeowners that build in the floodplain, if it's a new construction home, they build in the floodplain, they're going to have to pay flood insurance when they move in. And they're going to have to carry that. Usually that flood insurance is a year-long insurance, right? So they'll buy flood insurance, they'll pay their upfront premium, and then they'll work through that LOMAR process or the LOMAR-F process. Once that LOMAR-F process is finalized, they can go back to their flood insurance carrier and say, hey, I want to cancel my coverage, and oftentimes they'll issue a refund for the remainder of the time that policy would have been in effect. So it'll cost them up front, but then oftentimes they get some of that money back if the LOMAR-F actually comes to fruition. So
Another question for you.
Yep.
So, well, I've run into one thing where sometimes a bank is the one that decides whether or not that requirement has to be there for a LOMA. When you get a certificate that says, you're out due to, natural grade. But I've had banks that have turned around and said, no, we're going to still have you keep that insurance. So I'm wondering if it's the same way with the LOMAR F, if a bank could turn around and say, no, we're going to have you keep that if you run into that. And then there's a question on here if there's any ongoing responsibilities or obligations for the property owner after receiving the LOMAR F.
So the first one about the banks can require you to carry flood insurance regardless of whether you're in a flood hazard area or not. My recommendation there would be find a new bank, because they can still require that, because there is still some level of risk, right? We know that just because you're not in a flood hazard area, there's still risk there. And so, but there's oftentimes banks that will refinance you or find a way to fund that without requiring the flood insurance policy. So but it doesn't hurt to have flood insurance, so sometimes it's just worth keeping it just to cover yourself.
Good
And
answer,
then for
Ben.
the second question, obligations for property owners after receiving the LOMAR-F. There's not really an obligation, but it's nice to keep that documentation and then pass that documentation on if you're going to sell your house, or make sure the community has a copy of it, or it's recorded with the county as part of the property. There's different ways for you to pass that information down from one property owner to the next, but it's always nice that if you go and buy a house and a LOMA or a LOMAR-F has already been issued for that property, that you don't have to repeat that process. You have all the documentation. And then periodically, from time to time, the maps get updated. And so it's important for property owners to go back and reconfirm that, hey, the map's being updated. Am I being put back into the floodplain even though I was taken out once? Because as time changes and hydrology changes and mapping changes, potentially your LOMA could get superseded by a new map that is more conservative than the old map. And now you're back in the floodplain because the BFE went up, and the new study shows that that's the level of risk that FEMA is going to regulate to. then you would have to work back through that process to determine if you can actually get out or if you're back in the floodplain. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes LOMAs can be superseded by updated studies. Okay, let's talk about LOMARs. We're going to kind of cover it, do an overview of it. I don't have time to go into all the minute details of LOMARs and the different types and the different applications and when and where and how. LOMARs get complicated because you're actually going to revise the mapping. And that means that you've got to establish that LOMAR based on all of the standards and procedures that FEMA requires in their guidance and standards. The nice thing is that FEMA is the one reviewing that. The community has to concur with it, but FEMA is really the one that's going to review and approve it. And really the developer or the person submitting that LOMAR, they have to work through that process with FEMA reviewers to get approval on it. And so as community officials, if you want to make sure you feel comfortable that it's being done correctly, but just know that you've also got the backing of FEMA to help review the technical aspects of that application to make sure it's being done correctly in accordance to their standards. So keep that in mind. Common LOMAR types are hydrology LOMARs, hydraulics, channelization, when bridges and culverts are put in, dams, levees, flood walls, alluvial fans. And then there are CLOMARs, conditional letter of map revisions. And those are, when there's a proposed change to the floodplain that is going to require approval before the change happens. So that's a CLOMAR. We'll talk a little bit about when those, when CLOMARs are absolutely required. So that way, okay, if this scenario happens, the CLOMAR is absolutely required. In a lot of cases, a CLOMAR isn't required, but communities can always request or require a CLOMAR if they feel like the LOMAR process or the proposed change is beyond the expertise of the review from the city or the community. They can always require a CLOMAR process up front. But if you feel good about, hey, this is reasonable and it seems to meet the requirements, then a CLOMAR isn't required. So an example here, this is a floodplain. This happens to be Mountain View Corridor, and this is the SR 201 freeway. They built these ramps for Mountain View Corridor, and they had to go through the LOMAR process because of all the changes they were making to the floodplain and the different structures they were adding. UDOT actually worked with the community here. I believe it was West Valley City, I think it was West Valley City, to come up with the LOMAR process. Submitted that and got approval through FEMA for that LOMAR. You can see on the map now, though, this is the actual firm, the special flood hazard area, and you can see that it's outlined in blue and shows that, hey, this is a LOMAR that was submitted in 2022, I believe, for this section of map, and it reflects that change within that blue area. Is that reflected change on the map? Okay, so when is a CLOMAR required? Let's talk about that. So we're going to go to 44 CFR 60.3 C and D. So under section 13 of C, this is where we have no regulatory floodway. We have a zone AE with just a floodplain and base flood elevations. It says a community may approve certain development in zone A1, AE, AH on the community's firmed, which increase the water surface elevation of the base flood more than 1 foot, provided that communities first applies for a conditional firm revision. So in section C, where we have an AE zone without a floodway, if we're going to cause more than 1 foot of rise with our encroachment, then we have to get a CLOMAR. Then there's section D, which is where we have a regulatory floodway, and that says a community may permit encroachments within the adopted regulatory floodway that would result in an increase in the base flood elevation, provided that the community first applies for a conditional firm and floodway revision. So if we have a zone AE with a floodway and we're going to encroach on that floodway and we're going to cause any rise, like 0.01 feet of rise, then we have to go through the CLOMAR process before we can permit the encroachment. So those are the two different scenarios where CLOMARs are absolutely required. There's also the off chance that the community has a higher standard in their ordinance that requires a CLOMAR submittal. So communities can require a CLOMAR outside of these two specific requirements on the federal code. Any questions on those? Okay. So when should we submit a LOMAR? When should a LOMAR be submitted? When a CLOMAR is approved, so if you get a CLOMAR for a project because you're causing either more than 1 foot of rise or you're causing a ride within a floodway, then after the project is done, you need to submit a LOMAR on that project, because that's how you get the final approval from FEMA saying, yeah, your CLOMAR was approved, you built the project, but you never did the LOMAR. That doesn't button up the project. You need to make sure you button up the project at the end and get that CLOMAR or get that LOMAR at the end. And then when completing projects resulting in a change into the flood risk. So if you're causing a change that needs to be reflected on the maps because you're changing the flood risk to adjacent properties, you should go through the LOMAR process. And then some communities have a higher standard in their ordinance that require LOMAR submittals for other projects. So keep that in mind. Okay, what is required for a submittal of a LOMC? So we're just going to go through quickly and talk about the submittal requirements. So the MT for LOMAs and LOMAR Fs, you're going to use the MTEZ or the MT1 forms. The MTEZ is only for LOMAs, and it's only for LOMAs that are on a single residential lot or structure. So it's an easy form, right? It's easy to fill out. So those are, it's kind of a special case scenario where they wanted to make it really easy for the applicants. So they created an MTEZ form, but it's very restrictive in terms of what can actually be applied for on that form. So if you can't use the EZ form for your LOMA, you can always use the MT1 form for your LOMA. And use MT1 for LOMAs, CLOMAs, LOMAR Fs, and CLOMAR Fs. They do require an elevation certificate. You can use the online LOMC application if you're doing the MT1 form. MTEZ does not require community acknowledgement, but the MT1 form does require community acknowledgement. So keep that in mind. Okay, this is what that form looks like. This is the MT1 form. You can see here, you check the boxes, and there's a bunch of instructions that go along these forms. You can follow the instructions. They're pretty well laid out. Usually what I'll do is I'll fill out this form by hand before I then try to put the application into the FEMA online LOMAR form, because it's easier just to make sure you've checked all the boxes, you have all the information you need, you've got the community acknowledgement, and then go online and fill out the application and hit submit. That's just a tip. So LOMARs and CLOMARs. LOMARs, you have to use the MT2 forms, and Form 1 is an overview of concurrence and signatures, and then the Forms 2 through 6 really depend on what you're doing. What your project entails determines which section, which forms you have to also include with your Form 1. So if your LOMAR is based on riverine hydrology and hydraulic changes, you're going to do Form 2. If it's based on a riverine structure like a bridge or a channelization, dams, levees, all of those go on Form 3. And then Form 4, 5, and 6 are a lot less common, especially in Utah. We don't have many coastal zones, and then not many alluvial fan zones. So usually in Utah, we'll see Form 1, 2, 3 being used for an application. This is what those forms look like. So when you're going through to fill out your LOMAR forms, it's important that you understand the modeling that has to go into those applications. Generally, when you're going to do a hydraulic change using a LOMAR process, you need to make sure that you go through the model revision process correctly to be able to establish the comparison between the existing model and the proposed model. And so this is that process that you would go through. We actually have a training that we are putting on. It will be offered in August. We haven't picked the exact date, but it's discusses modeling within floodplain mapping and how to be able to approve the models that are submitted to communities. So watch for a training announcement to come out from Tracy and also from the USMA board on that specific training. But it goes into more detail on these different modeling types and how to review and approve the modeling. But the basics here is that when you go through a LOMAR process, you're going to obtain the effective model, either the hydrology model or the hydraulic model. There's oftentimes the need for a duplicate effective or a corrected effective model. Then you establish the existing condition model. You establish the proposed condition model, and then you compare the existing and proposed models, and that gives you your no-rise certification, or that's what you're going to submit as proof that your project fits within the requirements of a LOMAR process. Is an existing and a proposed condition model that you've compared that show the change. So we'll talk just a little bit briefly about these different types. You can always, if you're wondering where to get your existing condition model from, the effective models can be found from FEMA on their engineering data search. You can also go onto the CNMS, which is the Coordinated Needs Management Strategy viewer, and see what those models are that are available. So the CNMS viewer, I highly recommend that you get familiar with that. You can go on there, you can zoom into your community, and you can click on the stream reach that you're interested in, and it will actually show you what's available. What model was used for that specific study. Then you can request that model through a library data request from FEMA, and they'll get you that model information. So a duplicate effective is basically your engineering a duplicate effective model. So you're correcting for either you're basically taking that effective model and you're making a duplicate of it to correct for changes that have happened. Your corrected effective has, you recognize there's technical errors, and you're going in and correcting those errors as part of that corrected effective model. Your existing condition model then is developed, and you're basically showing what the existing condition is before the proposed change. And then your proposed condition model shows the difference with the proposed change. So again, there's more details in the training that we're going to put on in August about those different types of modeling. And then you do a comparison. Usually it's in a table like this, where you compare all those different models together and show the rise or the change that you're causing in the floodplain. And all of that then gets packaged up and submitted as part of your application to FEMA. Okay, so knowledge check. Elevations from which model should be compared to demonstrate the project rise? Do we compare the existing condition model and the proposed condition? Do we compare the duplicate model and the existing condition model? Or do we compare the effective model and the duplicate model? Which one shows the actual resulting rise of the project? A, B, C, or D? Give me a second to answer that. Okay, looks like answers are coming in. And A is the correct model, or the correct answer to that question. We compare the existing condition and the proposed condition model. Great. Okay, we're going to go through a few examples real quick. Each of these examples, I just want to point out kind of, what the scenario was, and then what was done to basically come up with the solution for that project. So this first one, you can see the property there in red is an identified home within a special flood hazard area. The zone is zone AE. It's a pre-firm structure, so the structure was built before the mapping was ever produced. They're currently paying flood insurance, and the homeowner wants to know, how do I get out of my flood insurance requirements? Can I get out of my flood insurance requirements? And so comes the community and says, hey, what do I need to do? I heard, some of my neighbors don't pay flood insurance, but I do. Can I get out of that requirement? And so what do we tell them? Do we tell them they need to do a LOMA, a LOMAR? What does that process look like? So in this scenario where it's a pre-firm structure, they're currently paying flood insurance, their best option is to do a LOMA, because that natural ground that home was built on, it's probably built long enough ago. We assume that was just built on natural ground, and that natural ground is what's reflected in the map. And so if they can show based on a LOMA that the adjacent grade around their home is higher than that base flood elevation established on that map, they can get an elevation certificate, submit that as a LOMA, and FEMA will approve that LOMA process. So, we have the option of doing a LOMA in this case, and that's the easiest scenario. And so let's go with the LOMA first. If that doesn't work, then they could go through the other processes to try to update mapping based on a LOMAR, but likely that's way more costly than a LOMA. And so in this case, a LOMA is the best option for the homeowner. Okay, next scenario. You can see the property identified there. This is a proposed property development, and the home builder wants to build the home over the top of the regulatory Zone AE, floodplain, and floodway. And their proposal is to put in a pipe that extends along the back of their property, basically piping that section of channel and then tying it into the same, very close to the same confluence point with the adjacent channel. So the homeowner is okay paying for flood insurance. In fact, they realize that they've got 2 different flooding sources that are in their backyard. And so they say, hey, we want to pay flood insurance still. We're going to carry a policy, but we want to be able to build this house, and we want it to cover over the top of this existing channel. So what do we, as community officials, what should we recommend that they do as part of this process? Do we go through a LOMA? Do we go through a LOMAR? What does the process look like? So in this scenario, the recommendation needs to be that they submit a floodplain development permit and that they show that they're not causing any rise, correct? Because if they're causing any rise within a regulatory floodway, they have to go through a CLOMAR process. And so if we can show that there's no rise caused in that regulatory floodway, then we can go through, we can submit that no rise certification and build this home. If they want to get out of flood insurance requirements, then they would go through the LOMAR process. If they can show no rise and they want to get out of flood insurance requirements, they would go through the LOMAR process after the fact and update the mapping to reflect that channel change, the structure they put in there, that pipe. And then that would update the maps. The maps would then show the updated mapping, and their structure would not be within the special flood hazard area, and therefore they would not have to pay flood insurance. So it would be a no rise certification combined with a LOMAR in this scenario if they want to get out of flood insurance. If they want to keep paying flood insurance, then they wouldn't necessarily have to do the LOMAR after the fact, which is complicated, but that's kind of the process for that specific scenario. Okay, we got 10 minutes left, so we're going to zoom through the rest of these examples. This is another scenario where I wish I could zoom in here a little bit, but you can see that there's a lot of structures built along this channel and multiple structures within the Zone AE floodplain and floodway. The structures aren't built in the channel, but the channel just isn't accurately reflected on the map. The channel actually doesn't follow the mapping in multiple locations, and these structures were built outside of the channel, but the mapping is skewed from the channel, and so therefore they're built in the regulatory floodway. Homeowners don't want to pay flood insurance anymore. There's multiple of them that have complained that are interested in getting this map updated. And the effective model is so old that it's not available anymore from the FEMA library. And so this one is actually, so the homeowners want to know, okay, do we do a LOMA? Do we do a LOMAR? Each individual property could go through a LOMA process, but it's complicated because you've got the regulatory floodway there that they're built within. And so in this scenario, it's best to go through that revision process of, get the effective model. If we can't get the effective model, let's do an existing condition model. And the proposed condition model is basically the existing in this scenario because the homes are already built. But go through and get that existing condition model and submit it to FEMA as a LOMAR. And the LOMAR, what that will do is it'll correct the mapping through this whole development and reflect the actual channel alignment and the flood depths. And then that can be used as justification for these individuals to no longer have to pay flood insurance. So LOMAR process on this one with all of the multiple houses and the complications of the floodway and such. Okay, hands-on example number 4. This is a property, it's 9 acres. They want to put in 6 lots. It's a zone A floodplain, so reasonably safe from flooding. We have to make sure that they meet that standard. There's no effective model, and the developer comes to the community. They want approval to move forward with this development. They're not actually going to build the houses. They're just going to put the development in and then let the homeowners build the house. So what do we have to advise for this one? Is it a LOMA? Is it a LOMAR? So we know the developer is developing greater than 5 acres and 50 lots, which automatically should flag in your mind 9 acres is more than 5, so therefore they have to establish BFEs through this entire property and show what those BFEs are, and then they can compare those BFEs to their home locations and show that those homes will be reasonably safe from flooding. So that's the standard here, is we've got to have BFEs because we're more than 5 acres, and those BFEs have to be established using a detailed method. So we have to have some type of detailed engineering study that goes in and looks at the elevations and runs an analysis to establish what those BFEs are, because there's no effective model. It's on the burden of the developer to do that analysis in a detailed way. So and then present that data to the community and say, hey, I've got these base flood elevations. Will you approve this development within this area and these lots? Then the community can approve that based on it being reasonably safe from flooding. And then that BFE data that was established as part of the development process can then be used by the individual homeowners to get a LOMA, or by the developer to get a LOMA to show that, hey, all these properties I'm gonna put in, all these houses, they're all above the base flood elevations. Therefore, we can go through the LOMA process because we're not bringing in fill. If we bring in fill, then we have to do a LOMA-RF. But if we're not bringing in fill, we're just establishing a BFE and we're building outside of the floodplain based on those BFEs, then we can do a LOMA process. So that's the easiest, simplest method here, is to establish the BFEs and then go through the LOMA. Okay, example number 5, this is a zone A floodplain. Developer is proposing 4 acres of multi-family housings. There are 6 plexes. Effective model is not available. Developer wants to sell the development before the houses are built. He's going to sell to a home builder, and the home builder that's going to buy it from him is requiring that there's a reassurance that these homes will not be in the special flood hazard area. So the development is less than 5 acres and 50 lots, therefore it's not mandated that BFEs be established. However, the community can request that BFEs be provided. And in order for the home builder to have that reassurance and be really sure that these homes are going to be outside of the special flood hazard area, a CLOMAR would be the best way to go about in this scenario. That conditional letter of map revision will establish, FEMA will give you concurrence on that conditional letter of map revision, and if you build a development in accordance with the plan, that, you know, they're going to be out of the floodplain. So on this one, the CLOMAR process is most applicable. And last one, so this is a home that wants to build here in the blue area is where the home wants to be built. In order for them to access their home, they're going to have to build an access driveway and a bridge across the Zone AE floodplain with a floodway. And their proposed bridge is going to sit within that regulatory floodway. And so this is what they proposed. They come to the community, they want to know, okay, well, my home's not going to be in it, but you know, the bridge is going to be within that space. In this case, they're going to have to prove a no rise certification. If they can show no rise is caused by that structure, then they can move forward with the plan to put in that structure, and then they would look at a LOMAR after the fact. If they are going to cause any rise within that floodway, then they have to go through the CLOMAR process. And so those are the two scenarios here. It really depends on whether that structure they want to put in is going to cause a rise or not in that scenario. Okay, last knowledge text. A CLOMAR is required when an encroachment in the regulatory floodway causes more than 0.00 feet of rise. So a CLOMAR is required when an encroachment causes more than 0.00 feet of rise. True or false? Okay, it's like most people are answering there. The answer on this will be true, that if you're going to cause more than 0.00 feet of rise in a regulatory, key here is regulatory floodway, then you have to get a CLOMAR. Okay, we're about out of time. So just want to open it up for any last questions or discussion that people have.
Could you go back and explain the answer to that last question? I'm not sure if I understood the question right.
Yep. So an encroachment within the regulatory floodway, if it causes, let's say it causes 0.10 feet of rise, it's going to require that a CLOMAR be submitted. So if it's going to cause more than 0.00 and we're encroaching in a regulatory floodway, then we have to go through the CLOMAR process before we can permit it. Then after, it also has to get a LOMAR once it's built. But
that was tricky.
LOMAR
that more than, yeah, that more than was a tricky one there, Ben.
Yeah, I misunderstood that. I was like thinking, no, if there's no rise, we're good. But yeah, the more than's what got me. Okay.
More than, I know, that threw me off too.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry. I wasn't trying to be
And then
tricky.
to answer your question, Robert, yeah, a LOMAR would be required after the CLOMAR. And anytime you have a CLOMAR, you follow up with the LOMAR on it. So I know our time is coming down to the end. We did record this. It's going to be in 2 parts because I stopped the recording, but we did record it, and I will put it on our site. So if you want to go back and look at it, we can do that.